Welcome to Night Whispers for Sleep, where dark, unsettling stories help you slowly doze off. Relax and let the rain guide you into the night. The night hung heavy over the quiet neighborhood. A soft wind whispered through the streets, rustling the leaves of the trees like faint, secret voices. In a modest Japanese house, the warm glow of paper lanterns spilled through the windows, painting the tatami mats with gentle amber light. Inside, the house smelled of wood polish and simmering miso soup, comforting and familiar. The father sat cross-legged at the low wooden table, his hands wrapped around a small porcelain cup of tea. Steam rose slowly from the cup, curling in the lantern light like tiny ghosts dancing. The mother moved quietly behind him, smoothing the tatami with her hand, her fingers tracing the woven patterns with careful attention. The youngest child, a girl of 6, crawled along the floor, her small fingers brushing against the cool wood of the sliding door. She paused and looked up, noticing the shadow of a branch against the shoji screen. The eldest, a boy of 9, rolled a small wooden top across the mats, the clatter of it echoing faintly in the room. Outside, the garden swayed gently under the moon, the cherry blossoms brushing against the stone lanterns with soft, sighing movements. Cicadas called to one another, their constant drones steady and hypnotic, filling the night air. The father leaned back slightly, closing his eyes, letting the comfort of routine and the familiar scents fill him. The mother hummed a soft tune as she gathered the bowls from the table, the faint clink of porcelain against wood blending into the quiet night. A shadow flickered at the edge of the window, gone before anyone could point it out. The youngest yawned, rubbing her eyes with a small fist. The father noticed a chill brush the back of his neck, sudden and unexplained even though the room was warm. He shivered slightly. Sliding doors were checked carefully, each wooden panel moving smoothly, the paper crisp and intact. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the shoji, making the thin paper flutter like a heartbeat. The boy stacked his toys neatly, careful not to disturb the rhythm of the evening. A faint creak echoed from the hallway. The mother paused. She glanced down the corridor, noticing nothing but the dim glow of the lanterns fading into shadow. The youngest crawled toward her mother, clutching a small stuffed rabbit, and climbed onto the futon. She nestled against her mother's side, breathing slowly, the warmth of the blanket comforting against the night air. The father moved toward the window, checking the latch and ensuring it clicked firmly. The wind brushed the edge of the frame. It sounded almost like a finger tapping lightly, briefly. The mother smoothed the blanket around her daughter's shoulders, adjusting it carefully, ensuring comfort. Outside, the moonlight painted delicate patterns across the tatami, shifting with every gentle movement of the leaves. The cicada's drone continued, steady, hypnotic. A shadow drifted along the edge of the room, subtle, almost imperceptible. She noticed it briefly, then it was gone. The father exhaled slowly, brushing a stray strand of hair from his face. The faint smell of incense lingered from the earlier evening ritual, comforting, grounding. A soft rustle came from the kitchen, the faint movement of a curtain in the breeze. It seemed normal, but the timing was just slightly off, almost deliberate. The mother returned to extinguish the lanterns, each flicker fading slowly, leaving the room dim and serene. The children's breaths slowed, steadying in the rhythm of sleep approaching. The father stretched along his futon, feeling the firmness beneath him, the cool sheet against his skin. A branch tapped lightly against the window, a fleeting shadow cast across the room. He did not speak, but his awareness lingered, tuned to the smallest disturbances. The mother watched her daughter's chest rise and fall, each breath a gentle drum of life. The boy curled under his blanket, hands folded neatly, eyelids drooping slowly. Outside, the garden seemed almost unreal in the soft moonlight, shadows stretching across the stones and flowers. A faint tapping echoed from the bamboo grove, but vanished before it could be traced. The mother's fingers brushed the edge of the sliding door, checking alignment, feeling the smooth wood under her fingertips. The floorboards shifted lightly under her weight, responding to her careful steps. The father's eyes drifted toward the corner of the room, noticing a shadow stretch oddly across the wall. It flickered, then disappeared. The wind pressed again against the shoji, making the paper tremble softly, like the pulse of a quiet heartbeat. The cicada's song wavered slightly, a small, irregular hiccup in the night's rhythm. The mother adjusted the futon, tucking the blanket snugly around her daughter, whispering words she did not expect her child to hear. The father checked the window one last time, ensuring the latch was secure, the wood firm and unyielding. The small details, the tiny misalignment of a door, the faint chill at the nape of the neck, the irregular creak of a floorboard, were brushed aside. They were normal things, ordinary. Yet something lingered at the edges of perception, subtle, quiet, waiting. The wind in the trees whispered secrets no one could understand. The house seemed to breathe with them, rising and falling in rhythm with the family's quiet routine. The mother kissed the forehead of her sleeping daughter, lingering for a heartbeat longer than necessary, feeling the soft warmth of her skin. The father lay back on his futon, hands folded across his chest, listening to the ordinary sounds of the home. The faint creak of the hallway floorboard, the rustle of leaves outside, the sigh of the wind, all layered into a subtle symphony. Shadows moved slightly with the lantern light fading, twisting and stretching just enough to be noticed. The cicada's song slowed, then returned to its steady rhythm, hypnotic and endless. A small toy rolled gently across the floor as if nudged by an unseen hand. The mother noticed it, frowned slightly, then dismissed it. The children slept soundly, oblivious to the tiny disturbances brushing the edges of their home. The father felt the warmth of the futon, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the comfort of the ordinary. Outside, the wind whispered again, brushing lightly against the paper walls. The moonlight shifted, casting new shapes across the tatami, delicate and strange. The house settled into deep quiet, the ordinary comfort of home enfolding everyone within. But beneath that calm, something waited. A presence at the edge of awareness, small and subtle, brushing against perception like a faint chill that refused to fade. The family drifted deeper into sleep, unaware that the first whispers of disturbance had already arrived, and the calm that had been established carried with it a hint of unease, invisible but undeniable. The morning light filtered softly through the shoji, pale and almost hesitant. The room was still, too still. The children stirred first, yawning and stretching beneath the thin futons. The youngest rubbed her eyes and blinked at the soft sunlight. The father shifted in his futon, reaching for the sliding door to let in air. But the door did not move. It felt stuck, unusually firm, resistant to his usual gentle push. He tried again, sliding the wooden panel slowly, carefully, feeling the smoothness of the wood under his fingers. Nothing. A small chill ran up his spine. The mother sat up, her hair falling into her eyes, noticing the same thing. Her hand pressed against the wood, testing the latch. It was locked. From the inside. Impossible. The father's brow furrowed. He jiggled the handle gently, then with more insistence. The faint click of the latch echoed back at him, unnervingly hollow. The room behind the door remained silent, empty, still. The children noticed their parents' tension, their eyes widening in question. "Why won't it open?" the boy whispered. The mother shook her head, unease settling over her like a fog. They called each other, softly at first, then louder, more insistent. No reply came from inside the locked room. The father's hands pressed harder against the wood. The panel refused to budge. A shadow seemed to linger in the corner of the room beyond, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He knelt, examining the door more closely, running his fingers along the edge, the grain of the wood seeming to hum under his touch. The latch mechanism was perfect, intact, ordinary, yet the door remained locked. The mother's breath quickened. A faint, almost imperceptible sound came from the floor inside. It was a soft, wet squelch. The father froze. He knelt, listening. Then he saw them. Muddy footprints, dark and wet against the pale tatami, leading from the futon in a strange, meandering path. They were small but deliberate, the imprint of bare feet that could not have come from anyone in the house. The pattern was irregular. Some toes pointed outward, some inward, some curled slightly as if hesitating. The depth varied, some prints pressed deep into the mats, others shallow, almost hovering above the surface. The mother gasped. The boy stepped closer, curiosity overtaking fear. He He followed the trail with his eyes, tracing it slowly. It led nowhere, then vanished. Impossible. The father ran his hand along the tatami, feeling the dampness, the cold residue of earth and water. No one had entered. The windows were closed, the sliding doors locked. The children whispered nervously, clutching at their mother's sleeves. She's joking, the boy muttered, though his voice trembled. The mother shook her head, her hand pressed over her mouth. "This isn't a joke," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. The father crouched beside the footprints, noticing the tiny ridges in the mud, the way it had pressed into the mats, impossible to reproduce. They were perfectly formed. No one in the neighborhood could have entered, the surveillance cameras showed nothing, and yet the evidence was undeniable. The mother whispered a word she had only heard from her grandmother. "Yokai," she said. The children looked at her blankly. She explained slowly, carefully, that sometimes spirits or wandering visitors appeared in locked rooms, unseen by mortal eyes. The father scoffed lightly, though unease still crept along his spine. "Unlucky visitors," the mother murmured. The boy traced a print with his fingertip, noticing the irregular swirl of mud, the small indentations of tiny toes. The air felt heavier now, thick with silence. Every small sound, the creak of the house, the distant call of cicadas, was amplified. The father tried again with the door, jiggling the handle, pushing, pulling. The latch did not give. The room beyond remained silent, holding its secrets tightly. The mother felt a shiver that she could not shake, her hair moving slightly as if touched by a breath. They huddled together, staring at the footprints, unable to look away. The pattern was too deliberate, too precise. Too impossible. A faint smell of wet earth lingered in the room, heavy and distinct. The boy whispered, "Who could it be?" No one answered. The father's hands trembled slightly as he pressed against the door again. The footprints seemed to pulse in the dim morning light, dark against the pale mats, impossibly real. The mother whispered another word of warning, a charm she had learned from her grandmother, barely audible. The children flinched as the wind outside pressed against the shoji, making the paper tremble lightly. The father leaned closer to the footprints, trying to find an explanation, anything rational. They were fresh. Yet no one had come in. The mother's gaze flicked toward the ceiling, toward the corners of the room, as if the answer might hide there. A shadow shifted along the wall, subtle, too fast to identify clearly. The boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he whispered. She swallowed hard, trying to remain calm. "I don't know," she admitted softly. The father stepped back, exhaling slowly, though fear tightened in his chest. Every instinct screamed that something was not right. The footprints led from the futon to the center of the room, and then ended, as if the visitor had vanished. The mother pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to understand. Her grandmother's stories whispered in her mind, rooms locked from the inside, footprints that appeared and vanished, spirits unseen but felt. The father crouched again, examining the edges of the tatami, the faint depressions that had been made. No one had entered. No one had left. And yet, the evidence could not be denied. The room held its silence, thick, heavy, almost oppressive. The cicadas' drone seemed farther away now, distant, muted, as if the world had paused. The mother looked at her children, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. "They can't see it," she whispered. "They might be here," the father murmured, though he did not know if he believed it. The children shivered, holding each other tightly. Every sound echoed strangely, the faint jingle of the boy's toy, the soft creak of the futon, the subtle rustle of clothes. The footprints remained dark and impossible, proof of a presence that could not exist. The father felt a cold draft at his back, even though the windows were closed. The children's breaths came quickly, shallow, nervous. The footprints had arrived and vanished without trace, leaving the family with a silence heavier than any sound. The room waited. The air pressed down. The impossible had already happened. The morning had begun. And nothing would ever feel quite ordinary again. If these stories help you relax, you're welcome to tap like before you drift off. The morning light spilled softly across the tatami, pale and hesitant. The house felt unusually quiet, heavier than it had the night before. The father rose slowly, stretching, and approached the sliding door that had refused to open the night prior. He pressed his hand against the smooth wood, testing the latch carefully. Still locked. He frowned, trying again with measured patience, sliding the panel slightly this way, then that. Nothing moved. The mother appeared beside him, her hair slightly mussed, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Why won't it open?" she whispered softly. The children stirred, peering at the locked door with curiosity and unease. The father exhaled slowly, then picked up the phone with deliberate care. He called the neighbors first, voice low, measured. No one had seen anyone enter. No one had seen anyone leave. The street had remained empty all night, silent except for the occasional stir of leaves in the breeze. Even the surveillance camera outside showed only ordinary footage: empty pavement, shadows of swaying branches, and the faint glow of the streetlights fading with dawn. The mother pressed her hand to her daughter's, feeling the trembling beneath it. The father paced slowly, replaying the images on the small screen, trying to reconcile them with the muddy footprints he had seen. Impossible. And yet undeniable. The officers arrived mid-morning, shoes soft against the tatami, expressions professional but curious. They examined the sliding doors first, testing latches and panels with deliberate patience. Each mechanism functioned perfectly. No sign of forced entry. The first officer knelt beside the area where the footprints had been photographed. They were dark, wet, curling at the toes in ways that seemed deliberate, almost hesitant. Yet by the time the officer examined the scene in person, the mud had faded slightly, as though the prints themselves had decided to retreat. The second officer ran a hand along the grooves of the wood, noting how precisely the sliding doors fit together. Perfectly. The family watched silently, hearts hammering softly, breaths slow but tense. The father crouched beside the photographs, tracing the swirl of mud with his finger, imagining how a small human foot could make such impossible impressions. No one could explain it. The mother lit incense in the corner of the room, the smoke curling toward the ceiling in lazy spirals, carrying whispered prayers that seemed to hang in the air without reaching anywhere. The children clutched small charms given to them by their grandmother, repeating words they did not fully understand but that felt necessary. Footsteps echoed softly somewhere in the hallways, though no one moved. The father checked the windows again, pressing lightly against the frames, sliding the latches slowly. Everything remained intact. The air in the house seemed thicker now, almost tangible, pressing against the skin and weighing down the senses. The officers took careful photographs of every remaining trace, capturing the impossibility in ink and light. Even as they documented, the footprints seemed to fade further, leaving only faint depressions in the tatami. The mother whispered softly about yokai, about wandering spirits who could appear unseen and pass through barriers without effort. The father shook his head gently, though the unease in his chest did not lessen. The children began to whisper in the corners, voices small and tentative, describing shadows and movements that vanished when anyone looked directly. At night, the house seemed to shift subtly. Floorboards creaked in empty hallways. Shadows stretched and twisted in ways that did not match the angle of light. A faint draft drifted through locked windows, brushing the skin like fingers, almost deliberate. The father paced slowly through the rooms, hands tracing the smooth wood of sliding doors, testing each latch repeatedly. The mother moved alongside him, murmuring protective words, waving incense, performing small rituals she had learned from her grandmother. Nothing changed. The children slept lightly, one eye open, listening for sounds too small to belong to anything human. Neighbors called occasionally, asking politely if everything was all right. The family answered with measured calm, though each word carried tension, a faint tremor in the voice. The prints had been real. They had appeared and vanished, impossible and deliberate, and no one had entered the house. No one had left. The locks remained intact. The doors remained unbroken. And yet the evidence lingered, as though the visitor had pressed its presence into the very air. The father leaned against the wall, pressing a hand to his forehead, trying to reassure himself with logic and reason. The mother repeated prayers, circling through the rooms with slow, deliberate steps, waving incense, murmuring words of protection. The house held its secrets. Shadows seemed longer, corners darker, air heavier with each passing night. Even in daylight, the rooms felt different, aware, patient, almost sentient. The officers left eventually, polite, uncertain, leaving the family with photographs and an unsettling truth. No explanation. No intruder. Only the lingering dread and the memory of impossible footprints. The cicadas' song outside had grown faint, distant, irregular. Every ordinary sound in the house, floorboards creaking, the rustle of curtains, the soft sigh of wind, felt significant, loaded with meaning. The family slept lightly, hearts tight, senses on edge, knowing that the impossible visitor could return at any moment. The footprints were gone, but the house remembered, and so did they. The house had grown quieter in the days that followed. Yet the silence carried weight, heavy and deliberate. Objects began to shift subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if testing the family's attention. A small vase, perfectly centered on the low wooden table, would tilt slightly to one side in the morning. A sliding door, once carefully closed, was found partially ajar, even though everyone had slept through the night. The children noticed first. The youngest tugged at her mother's sleeve, eyes wide. "Mom," she whispered softly, voice barely audible. "Someone is moving things when we sleep." The mother glanced around, dismissing it at first, but unease prickled her skin. The father checked locks again, pressing his hands along the sliding doors, ensuring each panel clicked firmly into place. And yet, by morning, the locks sometimes engaged differently, doors shutting with a faint resistance that had not been there before. The footprints returned, sporadically, appearing in rooms that had seemed untouched. Sometimes they led to the center of the room and ended abruptly. Other times they faded as if evaporating, leaving only a damp, earthy smell lingering in the air. The family could not predict where they would appear next. The children whispered in corners, speaking of shapes in the shadows, forms that moved when no one watched directly. One night, the eldest child awoke to the sound of soft, wet footsteps across the tatami. She froze, heart hammering, listening to the sound that circled the room without pause, without origin. A cold breeze brushed her cheek, though all windows were closed. She shivered, pulling the covers close, unable to see the source of the sensation. The father awoke later, hearing faint whispers in the hallway. Words he could not understand, curling through the air like smoke. He rose slowly, trying to locate the sound, pressing his ear to the door of the living room. Nothing moved. And yet, he could feel it watching, lingering just beyond perception. The mother found a small chair in the hallway, slightly moved from where she remembered placing it. She frowned, questioning her own memory, wondering if she had simply been careless. But the chill in the air suggested otherwise. Every creak of floorboard seemed deliberate. Every rustle of fabric, every whisper of wind carried intent. The family's sleep became shallow. Exhaustion crept in with every passing night. The children clung to each other, afraid to close their eyes completely, listening for footsteps that might circle endlessly without warning. The parents argued quietly, tense and low-voiced in the dark hours of early morning. "This is just stress," the father insisted, though his voice trembled slightly. "Logic must have an explanation," he added. The mother shook her head, eyes wide, a chill running down her spine. "Logic cannot account for the footprints," she whispered. "The doors, the locks, the smells, the sounds, something is here watching." Shadows began to appear more frequently, curling along the walls and ceilings, fleeting but unmistakable. Sometimes a hand seemed to brush across the corner of a room, leaving cold air in its wake. The youngest child awoke one evening, clutching a small stuffed animal tightly. "I saw a face," she said, voice trembling. "Just for a moment." The parents listened, hearts tightening, unsure whether to comfort or fear the admission. Footprints appeared in the hallway one morning, damp and curling, tiny toes pressing against the tatami. They led to the futon, paused briefly, then vanished entirely as if the visitor had evaporated into the air. The smell of wet earth lingered long after the prints disappeared, strange and heavy. Neighbors began whispering stories, soft voices behind closed doors. They spoke of yokai, wandering spirits that appeared only when the house was sealed and doors were closed tight. An old tale was mentioned about visitors who could enter rooms locked from the inside, leaving traces that no one could explain. The family listened, half skeptical, half terrified, feeling the stories brush against the edges of their reality. One night, the father awoke to a faint whisper in the hallway, curling around the corner like smoke. He pressed his ear to the wall, straining to hear. A single word, barely audible, seemed to slip past his understanding. He pulled back, heart racing, unsure if he had imagined it. The mother later reported feeling a cold hand brush her shoulder as she walked through the kitchen. No one was there. Yet the sensation lingered, icy and deliberate. The children began sleeping in the parents' room, huddled together, eyes darting at shadows that twisted unexpectedly in the soft lantern light. Every ordinary sound, the creak of a floorboard, the rustle of curtains, the faint sigh of wind, felt amplified, loaded with intent, heavy with presence. The footprints became unpredictable. Sometimes they led to doorways, stopping just before the threshold, fading as if they had hesitated. Other times they appeared on the futon, small and wet, curling in impossible ways, then disappeared entirely before anyone could see them clearly. The father tried to rationalize, repeating mantras of reason to himself, convincing himself that there must be a natural explanation. But every night, the evidence contradicted him. The mother circled the rooms with incense, performing prayers learned from her grandmother. She moved slowly, deliberately, smoke curling toward the ceiling, chanting words of protection. Yet the air remained thick, cold, and deliberate, as if the house itself were breathing around them. Even the cicadas outside seemed to drone in irregular rhythm, distant and muted, responding to the energy of the home. The family's anxiety grew with each passing day. Small irritations turned to whispers of fear, whispers to tension, tension to near panic. The children began refusing to go to bed alone, dragging blankets and toys with them into the parents' room. The parents' arguments became quieter but more urgent, reason clashing with dread. Every shadow, every creak, every whisper confirmed that something remained, watching, patient, deliberate. Footprints faded into thin air, yet the memory of their shape lingered in the mind. The smell of damp earth and faint mud pressed against the senses, tangible though fleeting. The night stretched long, each hour measured in tension and silence. The house waited, patient, unyielding, as if aware that the family had noticed. Even in daylight, corners felt darker, air heavier, almost sentient. Objects shifted slightly when backs were turned, doors sometimes closed differently than they had been before sleep. And the footprints, small, deliberate, impossible, reminded the family with every appearance that the visitor had not left. It was patient, it was watching, and it was entirely untraceable. The morning after the latest footprints appeared, the house felt deceptively calm. Sunlight poured through the shoji, warm and gentle, illuminating the tatami in soft squares of gold. The walls were ordinary, the doors slid smoothly, the air smelled faintly of incense and damp wood. Yet the family could not shake the lingering unease. Each of them moved through the rooms with careful awareness, noticing corners, shadows, and the faint creaks in the floorboards. The father considered suggesting they move, that perhaps leaving the house might end the invisible pressure. The mother shook her head slowly, her eyes clouded with doubt. "Moving will not chase it away," she whispered. The children watched, silent, clutching their charms, their eyes wide and alert, following each subtle sound. Footprints no longer appeared in the rooms, but their absence brought no relief. The faint smell of damp earth lingered, sometimes drifting through the hallways at night as if reminding them of the visitor that had been. The family walked slowly, listening to silence that was too heavy, too deliberate, as if the air itself remembered. The father checked each door once more, sliding panels into place, pressing lightly on latches. All was intact. Yet they could feel it. The mother sat quietly in the corner of the living room, weaving small prayers into her thoughts, murmuring old words of protection she did not entirely believe would work. The children whispered to one another softly at night, telling stories of shadows that moved when no one was watching, voices that drifted past without origin. Even outside, when walking through the garden or the streets of their neighborhood, they sometimes felt the weight of unseen eyes upon them. They spoke little of it, but the tension followed them silently, settling in the chest, the shoulders, the back of the neck. The father sometimes imagined footsteps behind him as he walked to the market. The mother could feel the faint pressure of air that seemed almost like fingers brushing her skin in the corner of a quiet room. The family tried to resume ordinary routines, but nothing felt ordinary any longer. Meals were eaten quietly, conversation sparse, laughter restrained by the awareness that something had touched their home and might still linger. Neighbors, when asked, offered hesitant glances, recalling stories they had been told as children. Of yokai who moved unseen through the night. Of visitors who appeared only in rooms closed from the inside. Of footsteps that had no origin, vanishing without trace, leaving behind only the echo in memory. The father remembered the officer's words from weeks before, spoken politely but with unmistakable hesitation. No one entered, no one left, yet evidence exists. Those words replayed in his mind, a slow, deliberate drumbeat of unease. The mother sometimes woke in the middle of the night, feeling the futon beside her shift, though no one had been there. She would rise cautiously, incense in hand, checking the room, the doors, the windows, every latch, every corner. Nothing was found. Yet the sensation lingered. The children learned to listen to silence, discerning meaning in the faintest creak of the floor or whisper of wind through the shoji. They began to speak less, walking quietly through the home, careful with each step, careful with each glance. Even when friends came to visit, a subtle awareness followed them, a feeling that the house itself remembered, that it retained the memory of the impossible visitor. The father sometimes thought he saw a shadow at the edge of his vision, retreating as soon as he tried to focus. The mother smelled damp earth unexpectedly while preparing tea, the scent familiar yet inexplicable, carrying the memory of footprints that had long vanished. At night, the air in the house grew colder, heavier, as if holding its breath, waiting for something that might never appear again. The family considered that perhaps the visitor had departed permanently. But nothing confirmed it. The footsteps had vanished, but the weight of their presence remained. Every creak, every distant sigh of wind, every flicker of shadow carried potential significance. Even ordinary sounds became charged with intent, echoing through the mind long after they had occurred. The children slept with one eye open, clutching each other, imagining footsteps circling in the dark, but never daring to speak aloud for fear it might invite attention. The father walked the rooms slowly each morning, tracing the grooves of sliding doors, pressing lightly on latches, checking for the smallest imperfection. Everything remained ordinary. And yet he felt it. The mother whispered to herself during moments of quiet, words half prayer, half explanation, calling on old stories and local superstition. She remembered tales told in hushed voices by neighbors of locked rooms and intruders who disappeared without a trace. Of yokai and wandering spirits who appeared when houses were sealed and unobserved. The family began to accept that perhaps they would never know why it had visited, why the footprints had appeared, or whether it might return. The air itself seemed to respond to their thoughts, heavy and deliberate, almost sentient. On some nights, the father thought he heard faint footsteps echoing from the hallways, growing closer, then fading before reaching him. The mother sometimes saw corners of rooms darken in impossible ways, shadows stretching and twisting when no light should have cast them. The children occasionally whispered, describing movement at the edge of vision, forms that vanished when noticed directly. The house returned to ordinary stillness by day, bathed in sunlight and warmth. But night carried its own rhythm, deliberate, heavy, inescapable. The family spoke less of it over time, learning to live with the weight of memory and fear. They moved carefully through rooms, listening to silence, aware of absence as much as presence. The footsteps, the shadows, the smell of wet earth, these were reminders that something had been there, something that might still linger. Even when traveling outside, walking through the quiet streets of their town, the weight of unseen observation followed, subtle, insistent, unyielding. No one could explain it. No one had seen it. Yet the family could feel the invisible visitor as clearly as they could feel the floor beneath their feet. And sometimes, in the quietest hours just before sleep, they heard it again. The faint echo of footsteps circling slowly, deliberate. growing closer, then fading. No door opened. No shadow remained. Only the memory of being watched. And the house, patient and silent, waited. It began on a night when the lake was still. The air carried a chill that settled into bones. Duluth, Minnesota in the 1910s was a city alive with the clatter of industry. Ships creaked against the docks, their hulls slick with the cold spray of Lake Superior. Smoke from coal furnaces mingled with the fog of the evening, twisting like pale ribbons into the sky. Gas lamps flickered along the wet cobblestone streets, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than reason allowed. The scent of damp wood, iron, and cold water hung thick in the air. Most nights, the city hummed softly with life, the quiet of late evening broken only by the occasional carriage or the distant shout of a dock worker. But that night, a strange hush fell, and even the wind seemed to hesitate. It came slowly at first. A fog thicker than any winter mist, curling in from the lake like a living thing. It rolled over the harbor, swallowing the piers, the boats, the lights. People noticed it first at their doorsteps. A chill that wasn't from the cold seeped into their homes, sliding along the floors and curling around the edges of their windows. Neighbors whispered to one another in muted tones, unsure if it was mist or something else. The fog did not behave as fog should. It moved in waves as if breathing, sometimes creeping uphill against the stubborn north wind. It hugged the walls of houses, spilled through alleyways, and pressed against door frames like it sought entrance. Citizens began to feel it watching them. Shadows flickered in corners where no light should reach. A cat hissed at empty air, bristling as though the fog itself had claws. Chickens vanished from coops, only their feathers left behind in trembling piles. Dogs whimpered at the edge of the mist, refusing to cross the threshold of its cold embrace. Some said they heard whispers. Soft, indecipherable murmurs like a crowd murmuring just beyond hearing. The sound seemed to slither around corners, drifting along hallways, brushing against the ears of those who listened too closely. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A trick of the wind. Imagination stirred by the uneasy light of gas lamps. But as the nights passed, the fog returned with increasing persistence. It crept through the streets even when no lake wind blew. Windows frosted over, not with ice, but with a damp, chilling mist that refused to dissipate. People began to notice that the fog carried a weight. It pressed down in bedrooms, filled hallways, lingered in corners long after the sun had risen. Footsteps echoed where no one walked. A rocking chair creaked softly, alone, on the porch of a house whose family had gone to bed hours before. The normal rhythm of life began to falter. Children refused to play outside in the evening, their small hands clutching blankets in fear. Shopkeepers shuttered their windows early, fearing what might wander through the fog at night. Even the brave few who ventured out felt a sudden chill that penetrated deeper than winter ever could. It was a cold that seemed alive. The fog moved around them, curling, watching, waiting. Some claimed it carried a shape, subtle and shifting. A shadow that passed along the walls, lingering longer than it should. Others described fleeting glimpses of figures within the mist. Tall, thin, or perhaps crouched low, always at the periphery of vision. When looked at directly, they vanished. Only the sensation remained. A gaze that lingered long after the eyes had gone. Pets went missing with increasing frequency. Chickens, cats, even dogs. Families found feathers and paw prints that simply ended as if swallowed by the ground. No tracks led back to the fog. No footprints returned to the homes they left behind. Whispers grew louder on some nights. Calling names, urging, coaxing. Yet no voice was ever clear. No one could determine their source. Residents began to dread the nightfall. Some bolted their doors and windows tightly. Others stayed awake, peering through glass, trying to understand the creeping presence. Yet even in the safety of home, the fog found a way to insinuate itself. It wrapped around chimneys, curled beneath doors, seeped through cracks in windows. The world outside seemed to pause, as if the city itself had been swallowed by the mist. Fences vanished into grayness. Lampposts appeared as ghostly silhouettes. Even familiar streets became alien, twisted by the fog into something unrecognizable. One elderly woman swore the fog moved differently depending on who was outside. It would retreat from some and approach others, as if it could sense fear, or perhaps curiosity. Families whispered of dreams disrupted. Children waking from nightmares insisting that the fog had been in their room. Adults awoke shivering, hearing the faint murmur of voices where there should be none. The city began to grow wary. The ordinary comforts of home and hearth were no longer enough. People began to leave doors open at times, perhaps to appease whatever watched from the mist. Or perhaps out of resignation, a quiet understanding that the fog would not be denied. It brought with it a stillness, a pause in the rhythm of everyday life. The simple act of walking through a street became an exercise in tension. Every step carried the weight of unseen eyes. Even the familiar harbor seemed strange under the veil of mist. The ships creaked in ways that felt unnatural. Their ropes moaned against wooden posts, sounding eerily like whispers carried through the fog. Some residents reported glimpsing shapes moving atop the waves. Faint, fleeting shadows swallowed again by the mist. By the end of that first week, everyone in Duluth knew the fog had arrived. It was not a passing weather pattern. There was something more, something patient, something that lingered with intent. The air itself seemed charged with an unseen energy. Even breathing felt different. Heavier, colder, laden with the sensation of being watched. And though no one could say exactly why, a quiet, unspoken fear began to settle over the city. A dread that would not easily fade. People whispered to each other in hushed tones, sharing stories of shadows that moved, of whispers in empty rooms, of pets that vanished into the gray. They spoke of it as the fog. Nothing more. And yet, in its presence, everything familiar became unfamiliar. Every shadow held a question. Every sound carried the hint of menace. Every night, the city waited. And the fog waited with it. The fog returned the next night, heavier than before. It curled through streets and alleyways, winding around lampposts and door frames like living ribbons of gray. Families began locking doors earlier. Children were warned to stay inside after dusk, cautioned not to wander near the docks or alleys. Even the bravest parents hesitated at the threshold, listening for faint whispers carried by the mist. Shopkeepers noticed a chill creeping through open windows. Paper rustled on counters, dust stirred, and small leaves skittered as if pushed by invisible hands. The fog seemed drawn to light, twisting around lamps, reflecting in glass, casting shadows that shifted and stretched. Whispered warnings appeared in local newspapers, timid columns printed in tiny letters, barely noticed in daylight. Neighbors shared stories in hushed tones, leaning close over fences, voices low, afraid of being overheard by the fog itself. Yet for all their talking, no one could explain it. It had no source, no reason for its persistence. People began noticing strange things at home. A rocking chair would creak in the hallway with no one seated. Footsteps echoed softly upstairs. Scratching sounds came from attics and corners. Dogs barked at empty rooms. Cats hissed at shadows, fur bristling, eyes wide. Some claimed shadows shifted along walls, moving independently of the light. A man in the Canal District swore he saw a figure watching from the mist outside his window. He blinked and it was gone. Only the chill remained, pressing against his chest like a hand. Small animals continued to vanish. Chickens disappeared from coops, leaving feathers scattered in dew. Cats went missing for hours, sometimes returning soaked and silent, eyes wide with terror. Even dogs strayed briefly into the fog, only to return trembling, shaking as if something invisible had brushed against them. Residents began keeping logs of disappearances. Paw prints led into the fog and simply ended. No tracks returned. No evidence of predator or passerby. It was as if the fog consumed them. By night, anxiety spread like a second, invisible mist. Sleep became shallow. People awoke to whispers, soft and teasing, vanishing the moment they focused. Doors opened or closed with no one there. Shadows shifted at the edges of vision, retreating when examined. Some townspeople refused to go out after dark. They bolted themselves inside, curtains drawn, hearts thumping at every creak. Others mocked the fear, daring each other into the mist. Some who mocked vanished. Homes left undisturbed. No struggle, no evidence, only the cold silence and the creeping fog. Children had nightmares. Dreams filled with mist rolling over streets, swallowing playgrounds, docks, and alleyways. They woke screaming, claiming shadows had tried to pull them from their beds. Even in daylight, the city felt different. Shadows lingered longer than they should. Corners appeared warped, streets unfamiliar, houses off-kilter. People spoke quietly of a presence. A feeling brushing along their backs just beyond reach. Shopkeepers noticed objects moving without touch. A broom shifted from corner to floor center. A book fell as if nudged by invisible fingers. One woman reported a child's laughter echoing down the hall. She had no children. Anxiety seeped into every action. Neighbors avoided eye contact, unsure if the fog might see them. People stopped greeting one another, murmuring softly instead. Even the mail carrier hesitated, leaving letters without knocking. Dogs barked at empty streets, eyes scanning the gray swirl for unseen things. The fog was no longer just a weather pattern. It had rhythm, presence, patience. Footsteps echoed along the docks late at night. Soft, deliberate. Yet no one was there when lamps were checked. Shadows flitted just beyond gaslight. Pigeons vanished from rooftops, leaving only echoes of cooing. Cats stared rigidly into corners, refusing to move. Whispers were heard inside homes. Soft murmurs around beds, windows, and kitchens. No source could be found. No explanation brought relief. Some began sleeping together, seeking comfort in numbers. Yet even in groups, the sensation of being watched persisted. People awoke feeling hands brushing their shoulders. Eyes lingering in shadows. The psychological toll mounted. People grew jumpy, defensive, suspicious of neighbors' movements. Rumors of disappearances spread, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes true. The fog's grip tightened with each night. Ordinary actions were altered. Walking home became an ordeal. Every step measured. Every breath cautious. Even errands required thought and care. A trip to the bakery became a journey through gray uncertainty. Shadows moved along familiar walls, the fog masking faces, changing shapes. It seemed to know where people were. Following, waiting, lingering. Some reported sudden cold spots in rooms where the fog should not reach. Yet it pressed, silent, heavy, patient. The docks were unsettling. Ships swayed with eerie rhythm as if responding to the fog's invisible breath. Fishermen hesitated to sail even briefly. The lake whispered in response, a low murmur against hulls and piers. Families kept vigil by windows at night. Huddled together, listening for rustling leaves, distant moans, creaking wood. Some swore the fog had a mind, lingering longer for those who feared it most. Feeding on that fear, silence no longer comforted. Even crickets seemed muted under the weight of gray. Daytime could not erase unease. Sunlight failed to undo shadows and memories. The fog had altered the city subtly, irrevocably. It touched everything, everywhere, even when unseen. Nights continued. Families stayed inside, doors locked, children silent. Shopkeepers closed early, leaving the fog free to move. Those who mocked it disappeared. Those who fled were never seen again. Those who stayed felt a presence that would not relent. The fog tightened its grip. Slowly, patiently, relentlessly. Watching, whispering, waiting. The fog had grown thicker, more insistent. It seemed to linger longer, curling around buildings, slipping through cracks, filling the streets like a living presence. People began to hear their names whispered in the darkness. Softly, almost kindly, calling them outside. No one else was there. Shadows began to move independently of light sources. A lamp would cast a shadow in one direction and it would twist or stretch in another. Some shadows mimicked movements incorrectly, lagging behind or stepping where the person had not moved. Children began speaking of fog people, figures that flitted just beyond the corner of their eyes, watching, waiting. They vanished when approached, leaving only the lingering sense of being observed. More pets disappeared with increasing frequency. Dogs, cats, even farm animals vanished, only to reappear days later far from home. Soaked and silent, eyes wide with fear. Signs of distress etched into their bodies, though no wound was visible. Some people vanished entirely. Brave souls who mocked the fog or tried to challenge it walked into the gray and never returned. Only personal belongings were found. A hat here, a coat there. Footprints leading into the fog, ending abruptly as if swallowed by the mist itself. Local scientists were called in. They measured barometric pressure, checked wind patterns, studied temperature and humidity. Nothing explained it. The fog ignored instruments and calculations alike. Clergy visited homes, offering prayers and blessings. Candles burned in windows, salt sprinkled along thresholds. Still, the fog moved undeterred, patient, deliberate. Police patrolled streets at night, lanterns held high. They reported footsteps echoing along empty sidewalks. Doors opening on their own, then closing with soft thuds. Yet no intruder could be found. A local newspaper editor wrote quietly in his notes, "No explanation can account for this creeping presence. Our city sleeps uneasily," he wrote. Rumors spread quickly among residents. Stories of shadows that moved against the wind, of lights flickering in empty rooms, of objects subtly displaced. A rocking chair would sway on a porch with no one seated. A door would creak open in the dead of night, though the family slept inside. Even furniture seemed to shift when no one was looking. The sense of being watched became unbearable for many. People reported that the fog seemed to respond to fear, lingering longer where anxiety was greatest. Some claimed that it could sense courage. Stepping forward, they felt the mist recoil slightly as if it were cautious of boldness. Children no longer played near the docks. Fishermen refused to leave harbor after dusk. The city became quieter at night, even the usual sounds of industry muted beneath the weight of gray. Families huddled by windows, listening for every sound. Every rustle of leaves, every faint creak of wood, every whisper of wind set hearts racing. Neighbors stopped meeting in the streets. Even brief greetings were whispered, hurried, and then abruptly ended. The fog seemed to infiltrate the ordinary. Simple acts became fraught with tension. Walking from the market to home meant passing through shifting walls of gray. Street corners became strange and unfamiliar even for lifelong residents. Doors creaked without wind. Windows fogged from the inside, obscuring familiar views. Even in daylight, the memory of night's mist lingered. People reported dreams in which the fog came inside their homes, covering the floor, creeping along the walls, whispering their names softly. They awoke shivering, unable to shake the feeling of being observed. Some tried to document their experiences. Journals filled with faint footprints, impossible angles of shadows, and soft sounds that left no trace. The city began to wonder whether the fog had a mind of its own. Some said it studied them, learned their habits, and waited for moments of weakness. Others believed it was merely a natural phenomenon gone strange. But the natural world had never felt so deliberate, so aware. Whispers began to carry subtle messages. Warnings, suggestions, words that seemed to hover just beyond understanding. People hesitated before speaking aloud, afraid the fog would hear and respond. The more they feared, the thicker the mist seemed to become. More brave souls ventured out, hoping to confront it. Few returned. Those who did spoke in whispers as if the fog might still be listening. They described sensations of being followed. Shadows moving where no light could reach. The air heavy with something unseen. Dogs howled in the distance, though no other animals were near. Lights flickered along the harbor, casting strange reflections on the water. The lake itself seemed changed. Ripples moved against the wind, lapping at docks in unnatural rhythms. Even the strongest men felt hesitation climbing aboard their ships. The fog seemed to understand the city's routines. Following, waiting, knowing which windows would be opened, which doors would be left unlocked. Families began using lights strategically, candles burning along thresholds, hoping to guide the fog away. Some swore it avoided bright fires. Others said the fog was patient enough to wait for nightfall and slip in when they slept. Children claimed the fog people sometimes smiled at them, or waved, then disappeared, leaving only a cold hush in the air. People began to whisper to one another about patterns, about strange noises and fleeting glimpses. A rocking chair moving on its own, a window shutter swinging silently, a door softly closing. Even the sound of someone breathing nearby could be mistaken for the fog's presence. The city grew tense and quiet at night. Footsteps were measured and deliberate, conversations hushed, every movement cautious. Families stayed near each other and doors remained locked. But even in clusters, the feeling of being watched persisted. The fog had become more than a weather pattern. It was a presence. A patient, deliberate, waiting presence. It whispered, moved, and observed. And the people of Duluth could do nothing but endure. Section 4. The fog becomes a legend. Decades passed, yet the fog remained in memory. Elderly residents recalled nights when it rolled silently through Duluth long before most could remember. They spoke in whispers of evenings when the mist had seemed alive, moving with purpose along the streets and docks. Some claimed it was cyclical, returning at intervals no one could predict. Time seemed different within its reach. Moments stretched, hours vanished. A man would step outside for a minute and find that the world had shifted for what felt like hours. Children lost in alleys spoke of minutes passing like an eternity. The fog became woven into the city's consciousness. Stories spread along the waterfront, shared in quiet corners of homes and taverns alike. Artists sketched it in charcoal and ink. Painters tried to capture its gray folds and curling tendrils, though none succeeded. Musicians composed somber melodies inspired by the eerie hush it brought. Writers filled pages with shadowed figures and whispers of the mist. Local children feared walking near the docks after nightfall. Fishermen refused to sail when the fog rolled in. Even grown men hesitated at the harbor's edge, lanterns trembling in their hands. The city's folklore grew. The fog was no longer simply a natural occurrence. It became a presence, patient and deliberate, watching from the corners of perception. People spoke of its intelligence quietly, never allowed for fear it might hear. It seemed to study the city, to learn the habits of its residents, and to wait for moments of weakness. Those who ventured out at night too often did not return. Or returned altered, silent, eyes wide with a fear that could not be named. The stories became legends. Names of missing people whispered alongside tales of vanished pets and shadows that moved against the wind. Newspapers chronicled it cautiously. Editors printed columns on the fog's strange persistence, warning citizens in muted tones. No meteorologist could explain it. Humidity, barometric pressure, wind speed, all readings were normal. Yet the fog defied every instrument. It moved with a purpose, curling along streets, following alleys, slipping into homes. Police kept logs of missing people and animals. Reports were meticulous, yet the cause remained a mystery. Even official authorities admitted they could do nothing. Some spoke of seeing figures in the mist. Shadowed silhouettes at the edge of the harbor. Flitting along rooftops, vanishing when approached. People began leaving offerings at the docks. Lanterns burning, coins placed near railings, candles flickering on windowsills. As if the fog required acknowledgement, a silent respect for its presence. Yet none of it altered its behavior. The city lived under a quiet dread. Even in daylight, the memory of night's fog lingered. Shadows seemed darker, corners deeper, every alleyway uncertain. The fog had embedded itself in the culture of Duluth. Stories were passed down to grandchildren. Warnings given to children: do not wander near the docks when gray mist curls along the harbor. Artists captured its shapes and patterns. Poets wrote of its hush, the subtle whispers, the way it lingered in homes and minds. Musicians composed pieces that evoked the shifting, curling gray. It became more than weather. It became a character in the city's ongoing story. Elderly women swore they could sense it watching them from windows across the street. Men claimed it followed them silently to the end of the pier. Even the animals knew it, retreating indoors long before humans noticed its presence. People spoke quietly of strange phenomena. Time that seemed to skip, minutes stretching into hours. Footsteps in empty rooms, doors opening and closing without touch. Shadows moving independently of light. The fog seemed to hold memory, remembering where people lived, where they worked, who they were. And it waited. Always patient, always deliberate. Some nights, it would vanish as suddenly as it appeared. Only to return later, curling more densely through streets and alleys, carrying the same whispers and chilling hush. Even scientists could not dismiss it entirely. Meteorologists recorded its arrival and departure, noting no change in the atmosphere to explain it. Clergy offered prayers, blessings, and salt along thresholds. Nothing altered its behavior. It had become woven into the life of the city. People carried stories in their hearts, legends on their lips, always with a sense of caution and awe. Children were warned to respect its presence, to fear it gently, to never mock it. The fog's patience made it seem almost sentient. It studied, waited, and perhaps learned. Those who disappeared became part of its story. Names added to a long, unbroken chain of mystery. Those who returned spoke in whispers. They described shadows that lingered just beyond reach. Sounds that seemed to follow them, teasing, observing, unseen. The ordinary became infused with uncertainty. Doors creaked in homes where everyone slept. Windows fogged from inside despite the warmth of the room. Furniture shifted ever so slightly, as if nudged by unseen hands. The city itself felt altered. Every street corner, alleyway, and pier carried a memory of the fog. Even familiar places were tinged with uncertainty. The legend grew. Elders spoke of the fog's persistence, recalling nights from decades prior. Children carried warnings like sacred stories. Artists, writers, and musicians immortalized it in their work. The fog had become both a natural and supernatural presence. A patient watcher of a city that dared not fully understand it. And those who felt it most knew. It was deliberate. It was sentient, perhaps. It was always watching, always waiting, always curling through the streets of Duluth. No one could escape it entirely, and so the city spoke of it in hushed tones. A legend embedded in every shadow, every whisper, every curl of gray along the docks. The fog had become Duluth's silent companion, unseen yet remembered, always present even when it was gone. The fog eventually disappeared. Quiet returned to the streets of Duluth. For weeks, sometimes months, the city breathed again. But the peace was uneasy. No one truly believed it had gone forever. Whispers of its return lingered in conversation. People remembered the nights when shadows moved independently, when doors creaked with no wind, when footsteps echoed along empty streets. Some claimed to have glimpsed it decades later. A swirl of gray along the harbor, curling around lampposts, hesitant yet deliberate. Others swore it vanished entirely after the 1920s, leaving only stories and a lingering memory. Families carried unease in their homes. Children were warned of the mist. Stories passed down, a cautionary tale about curiosity and bravery. Dreams were filled with fog. Shadows that stretched along bedroom walls, whispering names softly at the edge of perception. Figures that appeared in the corner of vision, vanishing when looked at directly. Pets disappeared in dreams as they had in reality. A cat would vanish from the hall, only to return soaked and trembling, eyes wide with unspoken terror. Even adults dreamed of it. Walking streets swallowed by gray, footsteps leading nowhere, whispers curling around their ears. No explanation was ever found. Modern scientists measured humidity, temperature, and wind. No unusual chemical, no atmospheric anomaly, nothing that could account for the fog's persistence or behavior. Police and historians recorded its presence. Yet even with careful notes, it remained a mystery. The fog became more than weather. It became a symbol. A creeping, silent force beyond human understanding. Something deliberate, patient, watching. It left behind a city altered. Even when absent, corners of streets seemed deeper. Shadows stretched longer than they should. Windows fogged inexplicably, even in sunlight. Footsteps echoed faintly across empty docks. People spoke of it quietly in low tones, afraid to disturb what might still be near. Some described strange sensations. A chill on the back of the neck. A soft whisper calling their name when no one was present. Doors slowly closing by themselves. Objects subtly displaced as if nudged by invisible hands. Even after decades, memory kept the fog alive. Stories persisted in homes, schools, and taverns. A grandmother telling a child to beware of the gray mist, to never wander alone near the harbor at night. A father warning that the fog watches, studies, and waits. It became embedded in the city's culture, a legend of the unknown. Artists and writers continued to be inspired. Music carried its eerie hush. Paintings captured curling tendrils of gray that seemed almost alive. But the fog resisted capture. No depiction could truly contain it. No description could fully explain its presence. Some families reported subtle reminders of its existence. A cold draft in an otherwise warm room. Shadows seeming to move against the light. Footsteps echoing softly in the attic. The city itself seemed to remember it. Alleys felt narrower, piers longer, streets subtly off-kilter. Even newcomers felt the strange tension of the harbor at night. Fear was no longer immediate, but it lingered quietly. A knowledge that something unseen had watched and might watch again. Some nights, the fog returned briefly. Curling around buildings, slipping through cracks, whispering softly to anyone who listened closely. Other nights, it was only imagined. A memory of fear, a shadow in the corner of the mind. People learned to live with it. Locking doors, avoiding alleys, speaking in whispers about shadows and movement. Yet no one could fully escape the anxiety it left behind. Generations carried the stories. Children grew up hearing about vanished pets and missing neighbors. Elders spoke of nights when the fog seemed alive, patient, deliberate. Even those who had never seen it knew to respect it. For some, the fog remained a test. A reminder that not everything could be explained. That some things moved quietly, patiently, beyond human comprehension. Psychologists and historians examined the stories. Dreams, nightmares, and anecdotes were documented. But no conclusion was reached. The fog defied understanding. Its influence endured. A shadow stretching across time, lingering in memories and in the hushed speech of Duluth's residents. Some nights, people swore they could hear it whispering again. A soft voice, almost teasing, curling along the edges of perception. A chill brushing their shoulder, eyes feeling the weight of unseen observation. Even when absent, it had left a mark. A sense of vigilance, of patience, of something that waited beyond the edge of sight. Every corner, alley, and pier carried a memory of it. Stories of missing people, vanished pets, whispered names. A presence patient, deliberate, and unseen. Some wondered if it had learned, if it had intention, if it might return to claim those it had studied before. The psychological legacy endured. Children dreamt of gray mist rolling through their rooms. Adults felt chills in empty hallways. Even pets hesitated at doorways and alley entrances. The fog's influence was subtle, pervasive, and never fully gone. Scientists could measure nothing. Yet the city still remembered. The mist became a symbol of the unknown, of forces beyond comprehension. A reminder that some mysteries are patient, deliberate, and indifferent. Some nights, it seems to return in memory, curling along streets, slipping through windows, whispering names in the dark. And one wonders quietly as the wind shifts and shadows stretch. If the fog returns tonight, will you notice it before it notices you? If you'd like more slow, quiet stories to help you sleep, feel free to subscribe.